Vermont, September 13, 1848. When Dr. Edward Williams arrived at the hotel in Cavendish, Vermont, he expected to find a dying man. What he found was a man sitting upright on the front porch, speaking clearly, asking when the doctor thought he might be well enough to return to work. The man's name was Phineas Gage. He was 25 years old, and through the top of his skull was a hole large enough, Williams later wrote in his medical notes, that a physician could place 2 fingers inside it without touching the edges. An iron rod, 3 feet and 7 inches long and weighing 13 pounds, had passed through his head less than 2 hours earlier. It had entered below his left cheekbone, traveled upward through the front of his brain, and exited through the crown of his skull at close to the velocity of a gunshot. It had landed 30 yards away, covered in blood and brain matter. Phineas Gage had never lost consciousness. He would survive. He would walk out of his sickbed 10 weeks later and live for another 12 years. He would work, travel, and speak in complete sentences for the rest of his life. But the man who survived was not the man who had been injured, and what had been taken from him, invisible, undetectable, leaving no scar that anyone could see, would take science more than a century to name. Before September 13, 1848, Phineas Gage had a reputation that most men spend entire careers trying to build. Born in 1823 in Grafton County, New Hampshire, he had risen by his mid-20s to become a construction foreman for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. His specific responsibility was controlled blasting, the precise, methodical use of gunpowder to break through solid bedrock so that railway tracks could be laid across Vermont's landscape. It was among the most dangerous jobs on any construction site. One miscalculation with a powder charge could kill the entire crew. The work demanded absolute precision, complete composure under pressure, and the kind of quiet authority that men follow without being asked. His employers described him, without reservation, as the most efficient and capable foreman they had ever employed. His crew trusted him with their lives. They were right to. His friends remembered him as energetic, practical, and restrained, a man who did not drink to excess, who planned ahead, who kept his word. He was not wealthy. He was not formally educated beyond what his work required. But he had something that money cannot purchase and education cannot manufacture. He was a man who could be relied upon absolutely. On the morning of September 13, 1848, Phineas Gage arrived at the blasting site outside Cavendish exactly as he had on 100 mornings before. He had no reason to believe this day would be any different. The procedure that afternoon was routine. His crew had drilled a narrow borehole into the bedrock. Gage poured in the gunpowder, placed a fuse, and prepared to compact the charge with his tamping iron, a custom-made rod he had carried on every job for years, with his name engraved on it. The exact cause of what followed was never determined with certainty. The most widely accepted account is that Gage was distracted, turned his head briefly to speak to one of his men, and brought the rod down before the sand covering had been placed over the powder. The iron struck rock. A spark met the charge. The explosion launched the 13-pound rod upward through the borehole with the force of a firearm. It entered Gage's skull through his left cheek, just below the cheekbone. It passed behind his left eye, leaving the eye itself, remarkably, intact. It tore upward through the front portion of his brain. It exited through the crown of his skull and landed 30 yards away, moving fast enough to embed itself partway into the earth. Gage was thrown onto his back. His crew ran toward him. He was already sitting up. Within minutes he was speaking. He was helped onto an ox cart and transported into Cavendish, sitting upright the entire journey, holding a conversation with the men beside him. He arrived at the hotel, walked onto the porch with assistants, and sat down in a chair. It was there that Dr. Williams found him. And then Dr. John Martin Harlow, the town's primary physician, arrived and assumed care. Harlow spent the following weeks doing everything 19th-century medicine allowed, cleaning the wound, fighting the infections that spread through the exposed brain tissue, and documenting everything with a methodical precision that would prove invaluable to science decades later. The first month was dire. Gage lost consciousness repeatedly. His wound became infected. His family was told to prepare for the worst. Then, against every expectation, he stabilized. The infections cleared. The wound closed. And roughly 10 weeks after the accident, Phineas Gage walked out of his sickbed. Physically, he appeared to be a recovered man. But something was wrong. Dr. Harlow was a careful observer. As Gage recovered, Harlow began noting things in his case reports that did not belong in a standard surgical record. Before the accident, Gage had been measured, restrained, and consistent. After it, he was fitful, erratic, and grossly profane, using language that shocked those around him in ways he had never done before. He made plans and abandoned them without explanation. He showed contempt for the opinions of others that was entirely new. He could not be relied upon to follow through on anything he said he intended to do. His former employers, when word reached them of his condition, refused to reinstate him. His friends, men who had known him for years, struggled to reconcile the person in front of them with the person they had known. They produced the most precise summary anyone would manage. They said simply, Gage was no longer Gage. Medicine in 1848 had no framework for what Harlow was documenting. The dominant scientific view of the brain at the time, held by serious anatomists of the period, was holistic. The brain functioned as a single unified organ. Damage to one part might slow or weaken the whole machine, but could not selectively destroy one faculty while leaving the others intact. Gage's case defied this entirely. He could walk. He could talk. His memory of his life before the accident was intact. His language was fluent. His intelligence, by every measure available to the medicine of his era, appeared preserved. And yet his judgment was gone. His self-restraint had evaporated. His capacity to plan, to follow through, to conduct himself in accordance with the man he had been, all of it had vanished. Not gradually, not partially, completely, and from the earliest days of his recovery. Something had been removed that the science of the time could neither locate, describe, nor name. Harlow kept documenting. Gage drifted. He worked at a livery stable in New Hampshire. He drove stagecoaches in Chile. He eventually made his way to San Francisco, where his sister cared for him in the years before his death. His sister would later report that there were moments, occasional, unpredictable, and brief, when something of the original Gage seemed to surface. A steadiness in his voice. A considered response. A flicker of the man he had been. And then it would pass, and the stranger would return. Phineas Gage died on the 21st of May, 1860, during a series of prolonged epileptic seizures. He was 36 years old. He was buried in San Francisco. And the story might have ended there, one extraordinary case, imperfectly understood, slowly forgotten. Except that Dr. Harlow did not let it end. In 1866, 6 years after Gage's death, Harlow contacted the family. He believed that Gage's skull, and the rod that had passed through it, represented a scientific specimen unlike any other in existence. The family agreed to an exhumation. The skull was removed. The tamping iron, which Gage had carried with him everywhere throughout his life, as though he understood instinctively that it had become part of his identity, was taken alongside it. Both were donated to the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School. They remain there today. And then, in 1994, everything changed. Neurologist Hannah Damasio and her colleagues at the University of Iowa did something that had not been possible in Harlow's lifetime. Using computer modeling and the precise measurements of Gage's preserved skull, they reconstructed the exact three-dimensional path of the tamping iron through his brain. The findings were specific and decisive. The rod had caused its greatest damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region at the very front of the brain. In Gage's time, it had no known name and no understood function. We now know it is responsible for what neurologists call somatic marker processing, the biological mechanism by which the brain attaches emotional weight to the consequences of future decisions. The internal sense, felt in the body, that one choice carries more risk than another. The signal that guides rational thought toward wise action. In plain terms, Gage had lost the mechanism that connects thought to consequence. He could reason. He could form plans, technically. But the emotional signal that tells a functioning person this will not end well, that signal was gone. Permanently. Irreversibly. It explained everything that Harlow had observed and been unable to name. The abandoned plans. The erratic behavior. The collapse of social judgment. Gage was not irrational. He was not unintelligent. He was, in a precise neurological sense, emotionally severed from the weight of his own choices. He had become, through no fault and no failing of his own, a man who could think, but could no longer feel the consequences of his thinking. Phineas Gage is regarded today as one of the most important patients in the history of neuroscience, not because of what the injury did to him personally, but because of what it revealed about every human being. His case provided the first systematic evidence that the frontal lobe specifically governs personality, social behavior, and executive decision-making, and that these capacities can be selectively destroyed by physical injury while intelligence, language, and memory remain entirely intact. It directly undermined the holistic theory of brain function that had dominated medicine for decades and opened the path toward brain localization, the understanding that different regions of the brain serve distinct and irreplaceable functions. The 1994 Damasio reconstruction became a landmark paper in modern neurology. It directly informed what is now called the somatic marker hypothesis, the theory that human decision-making is not purely rational, but is guided by emotional signals arising from the body, and that without those signals, intelligence alone is not sufficient to navigate a human life. His skull and his tamping iron sit together at the Warren Anatomical Museum. Medical students study them. Researchers continue to build on what they represent. One September afternoon. One iron rod. One man who survived something unsurvivable, and in surviving it, showed the world something about the nature of the self that medicine is still working to fully understand. That was the case of Phineas Gage. Subscribe to Prognosis for more real medical mysteries, shocking diagnoses, and unforgettable cases from the history of medicine. Disclaimer. This video is created for educational and storytelling purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. If you have any health concerns, please consult a qualified healthcare professional.